The water was at her throat, not metaphorically, not as some poetic expression of danger. The churning, brown, furious current of the Cimarron River in late spring of 1873 was literally pressing against the hollow of Alma Donnelly's throat, and she did not flinch. She did not scream. She did not reach for the saddle horn with the white-knuckled panic of the 11 other people who had already turned their horses back to the east bank and refused to cross. She kept her eyes fixed on the far shore, jaw set like iron, one hand gripping the reins and the other pressed flat against her saddlebag, as if she could keep the contents dry through sheer will alone. Her horse, a dun mare named Patience, was struggling. The mare's eyes were wide and showing white, her nostrils flaring, her legs working furiously against the hidden current beneath the surface. But Alma spoke to her in a low, steady voice, words that nobody else on that bank could hear, and Patience kept moving. The crowd on the east bank had grown silent. 11 wagon families, 2 lone riders, a preacher who had been praying loudly for the past 20 minutes, and a teenage boy who had started to cry when the water hit his stirrups. All of them watched Alma Donnelly push forward into the current that had already swallowed one wagon whole that morning and swept it a quarter-mile downstream before depositing it against a cottonwood grove in pieces. And from the far bank, having crossed an hour earlier with a cattle drive that was already grazing on the short grass beyond the tree line, one man stood apart from the rest of the drovers. He had pushed his hat back on his head. He was watching her with an expression that nobody nearby could quite name, because it was not the generic fear or admiration that the others wore. It was something more specific than that, something private. Isaac Merritt watched Alma Donnelly cross the Cimarron River with her teeth pressed together and her spine straight as a rifle barrel, and he felt the world rearrange itself around him in a way he had not experienced since he was a boy watching his father survive something that should have killed him. He felt, in some wordless and immediate way, that he was witnessing something that mattered, that she mattered. That whatever her name was, he needed to know it before the day was finished, because a woman like that, a woman who crossed that water with that face, was not someone the world sent along twice. She emerged on the far bank soaking wet, her horse trembling beneath her, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks and neck. Water streamed from her coat. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From the cold of that water, and the enormous muscular effort of fighting a current that had wanted, with genuine force, to take her under. She slid from the saddle and stood on solid ground, and she pressed her forehead briefly against Patience's neck, and then she straightened, turned, and looked back across the river at the 11 families still frozen on the eastern bank. She cupped her hands around her mouth. "The bottom is gravel between the second and third sandbar," she called across the roaring water. "Angle 10 degrees upstream and keep your horses moving. Do not stop. Do not stop for any reason." Then she turned away from them, and she began walking her horse toward the tree line to find shelter and dry ground, and she did not look back to see whether they followed her advice. Isaac Merritt moved before he fully understood that he was moving. He crossed the 20 yards of river grass between himself and the spot where she had emerged, and he stopped a respectful distance from her, and he took his hat off. "Ma'am," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark green, startling in that light, startling against the brown water still dripping from her chin. She looked at him the way a woman looked at a man when she had learned through hard experience to assess threat before anything else. He let her look. He didn't move. "You want something," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement offered without hostility, simply as a fact about the world. "Your name," he said, "if you're willing." That was when the story truly began. Not at the water's edge, not on the morning she had left everything behind, not in the wreckage of what had come before. It began with a man who had watched her do something extraordinary and had not offered help, had not offered rescue, had not spoken to her like a woman who needed managing. He had simply waited until she was on solid ground and asked for her name. And that, as Alma Donnelly would tell her daughter 11 years later while sitting on the porch of their house, outside Dodge City, watching the sun go down over the Kansas plain, was the beginning of everything. But to understand what that moment meant, you had to understand what had brought Alma Donnelly to the Cimarron River on that particular afternoon in May of 1873, soaking wet and utterly alone, carrying in that saddlebag the only thing she had managed to rescue from a betrayal so complete and so devastating that it had stripped her down to almost nothing. You had to understand where she had come from and what she had survived to get there. And then you had to understand Isaac Merritt, his own dark past, his own forced choices, his own hidden scars, before you could understand why that single moment at the water's edge would change both of their lives beyond any power to undo. Alma Donnelly had been born in 1849 in a small town in eastern Missouri, the third child of Patrick Donnelly, a blacksmith, and Margaret Donnelly, who had come from Kentucky with strong opinions about scripture and clean floors. Alma had grown up in the specific way that middle children of large, loud families sometimes grow up, by becoming quiet and watchful, by developing an internal life so rich and so fully her own that no amount of chaos around her could touch it. She had learned to read early and read voraciously, had learned to ride at age 8 on a neighbor's plow horse, and had discovered by age 14 that she had an unusual gift for animals. Not the sentimental, soft kind of gift that young girls were supposed to have, but a practical, almost clinical understanding of how animals thought and what they feared and how to communicate calm to a creature in panic. Her father had recognized this and treated it practically, the way he treated everything. He had taught her to shoe horses alongside her brothers, had taught her to read the condition of an animal the way a doctor read a patient, and had said nothing when she spent more hours at the smithy than in the kitchen. Her mother had said plenty, but Margaret Donnelly's plenty had fallen on a daughter with a spine already tempered like good iron. She had been 20 years old when she met Gerald Foss. Gerald Foss was 32, which was not an outrageous gap, and he was handsome in a way that made people trust him before he gave them a reason to. He had brown hair and easy manners, and a talent for conversation that made everyone in the room feel as though they were the most interesting person he had encountered. He had come to their town as a land agent, representing interests back east who wanted to buy up Missouri land for development, and he had conducted himself with the smooth authority of a man who knew the world and how it worked. Alma had not been swept away by Gerald Foss. That was the thing she would need to explain carefully and specifically when she finally told Isaac Merritt about it, because she did not want him to think she had been a fool. She had not been swept away. She had been convinced. There was a difference. Gerald had been patient and methodical, and had presented her with logical reasons to trust him, logical reasons to marry him, logical evidence of his character that had turned out, 3 years later, to be entirely constructed. She had married him in the spring of 1870, and they had moved to Abilene, Kansas, which was in those years a railhead town loud with the cattle trade, where Gerald had presented himself as an agent for a land development company that was buying grazing parcels for Eastern investment groups. He had a partner named Holloway, a thin, dry-humored man from Ohio who Alma had instinctively disliked from the first meeting, though she had no specific reason to attach to the feeling. She had noted her own instinct and filed it away, because Gerald had seemed genuinely easy and comfortable with her, and because the first year of their marriage had been, in the ways that counted most to her, relatively decent. It was in the second year that she began to notice the locked desk drawer, not obsessively, not with dramatic suspicion. She noticed it the way a careful person notices any small inconsistency, with a quiet mental note that something did not quite fit. Gerald kept a roll-top desk in the front room of their house, and most of the drawers were accessible and contained ordinary correspondence and business documents. But the bottom left drawer had a lock that he always engaged, and when she had asked about it once, casually, as a wife might ask about any ordinary household thing, he had deflected with such practiced ease that she had almost not noticed the deflection itself. She had not pressed. She was not that kind of wife, but she had watched. What she assembled over the following 18 months was a picture that revealed itself in pieces the way an image forms in a photographer's developing bath slowly, with shapes first appearing as shadows, then resolving into unmistakable clarity. Gerald Foss and his partner Holloway were not land agents. They were running a scheme involving fraudulent land titles, selling plots of Kansas grazing land to Eastern buyers, who did not know that the same parcels had already been sold to other buyers, or that the land in question had claims against it from the prior decade that Gerald had buried in the county records through what she could only conclude was corruption of a local official she had never been able to identify. The money involved was not small. She understood by the time she was certain that Gerald had been running this operation for years before she had met him, across multiple territories, and that the reason they had come to Abilene was that things in Missouri had become dangerous for him, and the reason they were likely to leave Abilene soon was that the same danger was gathering again. She said nothing. She waited. She understood that knowledge was only power if you were positioned to use it, and she was a woman in 1872 with no independent property, no legal standing in most regards, and a husband who was both charming and ruthless, which was a more dangerous combination than charming alone or ruthless alone. What she needed was time and the right moment. What she got instead was a night in November of 1872 when she came home early from visiting the woman 2 streets over who had a sick child, and she walked into the back room of their house, and she heard Gerald and Holloway speaking in the low, specific tone that she had learned meant they were discussing something they believed to be beyond her reach. She stopped in the hallway and she listened. What she heard was her own name, used in the context of a plan that required her compliance or her removal. Holloway had apparently been presenting the argument that she knew too much and that her continued presence was a liability. Gerald, to his credit or perhaps simply to his strategy, had been arguing that she was manageable and useful, and that removing her would create more complications than it would solve. The word Holloway used was handled. He said that she would need to be handled, one way or another, before they moved on to their next location, which he said was somewhere in the New Mexico territory. Alma stood in that hallway for approximately 30 seconds, and then she very quietly went back out the front door. She had 3 days before Gerald expected her to begin packing their household for a move he had not yet formally announced, but that she now understood was imminent. She used those 3 days with the precise, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been quietly preparing for exactly this contingency, because she had, over the previous months, established a small and secret cache. A little money, not enough to be missed from his accounts but enough to matter. The deed to her father's house in Missouri, which had been left to her, not to Gerald, when Patrick Donnelly had died the previous year, and which Gerald had been in the process of attempting to transfer into his own name through a legal process that had not yet completed. She had the deed because she had gone to the land office herself and extracted it on the pretext of needing to review it for a family matter. She had her horse Patience, who was unambiguously her own, and who no one could reasonably dispute, and she had the kind of practical knowledge that most women her age did not have: how to travel, how to shoe a horse if necessary, how to navigate by the stars, how to talk to men in authority without provoking them and without diminishing herself. On the 4th morning she was gone before dawn. She took nothing that was his. She took only what was hers. And she rode west, because west was the only direction that made sense for a woman who needed to disappear quickly and put enough country between herself and the past that the past would struggle to find her. She had been riding for 9 days when she reached the Cimarron. 9 days of sleeping rough, of eating sparingly, of pushing Patience hard enough to make time but gently enough not to break her. 9 days of watching her back on every open stretch of ground, of keeping to the less traveled routes, of stopping in small settlements only long enough to buy feed and supplies, and move on before anyone could form a clear memory of her. 9 days of being alone with herself and with the flat, enormous sky of the southern plains, and of discovering that solitude, even hard and frightened solitude, was preferable to the domestic trap she had been living in. She had arrived at the Cimarron on that May afternoon to find it running high from the spring melt of the mountains to the west, brown and fast, and carrying branches and debris that indicated how seriously swollen it was. She had found the crossing place that the old-timers called the Wagon Ford, which was the safest point on this stretch of the river in normal conditions, and she had assessed it the way her father had taught her to assess a problem, not with feeling but with information. The bottom was gravel. She had waded in on foot first, up to her waist, feeling the current push at her with honest brutality, and she had mapped the bottom and the current and the depth as best she could. Then she had made her decision. The 11 families had been there when she returned to the bank. The preacher had already started praying. A man with a large wagon had apparently tried to cross earlier in the day and lost the wagon, which accounted for the wreckage she had seen downstream. The families were afraid, and they had good reason to be, and their fear was entirely reasonable. But Alma had assessed the crossing and understood that it was passable if you knew where to aim and you committed completely, and so she had mounted patience and she had gone. She had not crossed because she was fearless. She had crossed because she had calculated the risk and decided it was acceptable. The distinction was important to her, even if it looked the same from the outside. What she had not calculated was the man standing on the far bank with his hat pushed back, and an expression on his face that she had never seen on a man looking at her before, not once in all her 24 years. Isaac Merritt was 28 years old when he watched Alma Donnelly cross the Cimarron River. He had been working cattle drives for 6 years, having come to it by the specific route of a man whose original plans had been dismantled by forces outside his control. He was from Ohio originally, a fact he rarely volunteered because it seemed irrelevant out here, where nobody cared much where you were from as long as you could do the work. He had been the son of a farmer and had intended, through most of his early life, to be something other than a drover. He had attended a year and a half of school at a small college near Columbus before the death of his father in 1864 had pulled him back to the farm. Then the farm had failed, as so many farms failed in the years after the war, and he had gone west because the cattle trade was where the work was. He was not a complicated man in the way that some men who had read books were complicated, by which he meant he did not torment himself unnecessarily or build elaborate architectures of self-justification, the way he had seen some educated men do when they ended up on the frontier. He was direct and he was honest, and he had a reputation among the men he worked with as someone who said what he meant and did what he said he would do, which was considered in those circles to be a form of wealth. He had never married. This was not from lack of desire or from some private wound, as men without wives were sometimes assumed to carry. It was simply that the life of a trail drover did not easily accommodate a marriage, and the women he had met in the towns along the cattle routes were mostly women whose circumstances he did not want to contribute to, which was his private way of thinking about the particular loneliness of the frontier settlements, where women were often either stranded or cornered by poverty and limited options. He had a younger sister back in Ohio named Clara, to whom he sent a portion of his wages every 2 months, and he had a friend named Del Hooper, who was the trail boss on the current drive, and who had known Isaac long enough to read his silences accurately. Del was the one who came up beside him while Isaac was watching Alma emerge from the river. "You look like a man who just remembered something important," Del said. Isaac didn't answer immediately. He watched Alma press her forehead against her horse's neck for that brief, private moment, and then watched her straighten and call back across the water to the families on the eastern bank with that cupped hands, practical, no-nonsense instruction about the gravel bottom and the upstream angle. "I might go ask her name," Isaac said. Del was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right. That was what Dell said, all right. Because he had known Isaac for 6 years and he understood, the way a person understands a clear sky or a compass needle, that when Isaac spoke in that particular tone about a particular thing, the thing was already decided. Isaac crossed the river grass and took off his hat and said, "Ma'am," and she turned those startling dark green eyes on him and assessed him with a directness that most women her age would not have risked showing a strange man on an open riverbank. And she said, "You want something," and he said, "Your name if you're willing." She looked at him for 3 long seconds. "Alma Donnelly," she said. "Isaac Merritt." He extended his hand, which was perhaps an unusual thing to offer a woman. Men shook hands with men, generally not with women. But it felt right, and she took it without hesitation, and shook it once firmly, the way a person shook hands when they meant it. "You going to Dodge?" he asked, because that was the logical destination for someone heading west from the Cimarron crossing on this route. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. "We are," he said, "delivering cattle to the railhead. 2 more days, maybe 3 depending on the pace." He paused. "The trail between here and there is safer with company. I can't offer you much, but I can offer you that." She looked at him again. The assessment again. He let her take her time. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question and it deserved a direct answer, and he thought about giving her a practical one. "There are rough men on this route, it's safer, the drive provides numbers," and all of those things were true. But he said instead, "Because I watched you cross that river and I would like to know more about a person who crosses a river like that." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly. More like the first small alteration in a wall that has been built very solidly and for good reason, not a crack, but a recognition that a wall was there. "All right," she said. "I'll ride with the drive as far as Dodge." She did not thank him. She did not perform gratitude. She simply accepted his offer as a reasonable exchange and turned to tend to her horse. And Isaac Merritt put his hat back on and walked back toward the cattle line with the sensation of a man who had just put his hand in a fire and found that it felt like warmth rather than burning, which was simultaneously a relief and the beginning of a new kind of danger entirely. The first evening on the trail to Dodge City, Alma kept to herself, as was appropriate and expected. She set up her bedroll at a careful remove from the drovers, ate the food Del Hooper's cook prepared without being asked but without presuming either, and spent the hour before dark checking patients over with the thoroughness of someone who understood that her horse's health was directly connected to her own survival. Isaac watched her from a distance, the way a person watches something interesting without wanting to disturb it. He noted the competence of her hands, the economy of her movements, the way she spoke to the mare in a low, continuous murmur that he could not hear from where he was, but that he could see calming the horse in real time. He noted that she had positioned her bedroll with her back to a natural rise in the ground and a clear sightline to the open prairie on 3 sides, which was the choice of someone who understood the importance of not being surprised in the night. It was the kind of choice a careful drover made. He had never seen a woman traveling alone make it instinctively. Del came and crouched beside him where he sat drinking coffee. "She's alone," Del said. "Yes," Isaac said. "She in trouble?" Isaac thought about it. "Seems like she's past the worst of it," he said, "moving away from it rather than in it." Del nodded. He was a man of economic communication, which was why Isaac liked him. "Don't complicate her situation," Del said. "Not as a warning, as a reminder." "I know," Isaac said. But the following morning, when the drive started moving at first light and Alma fell in naturally alongside the herd on the left flank, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had clearly assessed where she could be useful without being in the way, Isaac found reasons to pass by that flank more often than the right flank required of him that day. It was on the second such pass that she looked over at him and said, without preamble, "You were at the college in Ohio. I can tell by the way you speak." He was surprised enough that he showed it. "How do you know it was Ohio?" "The vowels," she said. "My husband had a partner from Ohio. They sound a particular way." It was the first time she had mentioned a husband. He let it sit for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the geometry of what it might mean. Had, he said. I left him, she said, simply, without apology or explanation beyond that bare statement, which was both a complete answer and a door left slightly ajar. Isaac nodded. He didn't press. He was aware, with the particular instinct of someone who had grown up in a large household where privacy was scarce and therefore sacred, that the door had been left ajar deliberately, and that pressing on it would not open it further. 1 year, he said. I was at the college 1.5 years before my father died. What were you studying? Natural history, mostly. I liked the way animals were organized, the science of it. He paused. Turns out that's actually useful in this work. She glanced at him sideways. I imagine it is. And then, after a moment, I can feel a horse's temperament through the reins within about 10 seconds of picking them up. I don't know what the science of that is called. Proprioception, maybe, he said. The sense that receives information through touch and movement. She considered this. Yes, she said, that sounds right. It was a small conversation. It covered no great ground. But by the end of it, they were riding 3 feet apart rather than 10, and neither of them had moved consciously to close the gap. That evening, after the herd had been settled, and the cook had produced a meal of beans and salt pork and cornbread that was better than it had any right to be, Alma sat slightly outside the circle of drovers around the fire, and Isaac went and sat near her, not beside her precisely but near her, and they spoke for 2 hours. She told him about Missouri. She told him about her father, the blacksmith, and about learning to shoe horses, and about the specific satisfaction of a task done with the hands that resulted in something solid and real. She did not yet tell him about Gerald or about the fraud or about the betrayal that had sent her west. But she told him about her mother, and about the way her mother had held opinions about everything with the fierce authority of someone who expected the universe to organize itself around those opinions. And she said this with a complicated affection that Isaac recognized as the way a person spoke about someone they loved and were exasperated by in equal measure. He told her about the farm in Ohio after his father died, about the specific grief of watching land fail, about the way the grass had looked in a drought year when the soil was cracking and the cattle were going hollow around their eyes from thirst. He told her about the first cattle drive he had worked, from Texas to Abilene, which was the route that had opened up after the war, and about the particular strangeness of that first long journey, the scale of it, the loneliness punctuated by unexpected beauty, the way the sky over the Texas plain at night was so dense with stars that it felt oppressive rather than awe-inspiring, until you had been under it long enough to stop measuring it against anything human. She listened to him with an attention that he had rarely experienced. Most people listened in the way that they were waiting for a pause to speak. She listened as if she were building something from the information, assembling it carefully into some larger structure he couldn't see yet. You don't miss Ohio, she said when he finished about the sky. No, he said, I did for a while, now it's just where I'm from. I miss Missouri, she said. I miss my father's smithy, the smell of it. There was a small silence that was not uncomfortable. Where are you going, he asked. Past Dodge. She thought about this honestly. I have a deed to a house, she said. Back in Missouri, my father's house, but I can't go back there yet. She paused. I need to put more distance between myself and the past before it becomes safe to stop moving. He heard the care in that word safe and understood that it was not used lightly. Is someone looking for you, he asked. She met his eyes. My husband may be, I can't be certain. He's dangerous, he's determined, she said. There's a difference, but in practice it amounts to the same thing. Isaac was quiet for a moment, processing this with the same methodical honesty he applied to everything. You were right to leave, he said. She looked at him. You don't know the details. No, he said. But you're not a woman who would leave without good reason, and you're not a woman who would lie about it if I asked you directly. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he could see something working in her expression, the conflict between caution and the rare relief of being accurately seen. No, she said, I wouldn't lie about it. Then you were right to leave, he said again. When the fire burned low and the drovers began pulling their blankets up for the few hours of sleep before the early start, Alma went to her bedroll and Isaac went to his, and the space between them was charged with something that neither of them was ready to name yet, but that both of them felt with equal clarity. The third day of the drive, they talked more continuously, falling into a rhythm that was partly the natural rhythm of two people riding alongside each other for hours, and partly something more specific to themselves. A mutual ease that felt, to Isaac at least, simultaneously immediate and entirely unprecedented. He told her about Del Hooper, about the years of driving cattle north, about the hierarchy and the culture of the trail, about the coded language of the work, and the particular loyalty that developed between men who spent months together in all weather depending on one another for the most practical and necessary things. She told him about Abilene. Not about Gerald, not yet, but about Abilene the town, its specific energy and noise, and the way the cattle trade had transformed it from a bare settlement to something almost like a city in the space of a few years. She described the stockyards and the hotels and the particular class structure of a boom town, where money was new enough that it had not yet calcified into tradition, and the way that created both freedom and instability. "You observed a lot," he said. "I observe everything," she said. It was not boastful, it was simply accurate. "What are you observing right now?" he asked. She thought about it. "I'm observing that you are the kind of man who asks questions because he actually wants the answers," she said. "Not because asking questions is the socially expected thing to do. Most men ask questions and then look away while the answer is happening." He smiled. It was a genuine smile, not a performed one. "That's accurate," he said. "And I'm observing," she continued, and there was something slightly more careful in her voice now, "that I am being watched by at least 3 of your drovers with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, which I imagine will become conversation when I'm not within earshot." "Probably," he agreed. "Does that bother you?" "No," she said. "I stopped being bothered by observation when I was about 15. It's only dangerous if you have something to hide." "Do you?" The pause was brief. "A dark past," she said, "but not one of my own making." It was the closest she had come to it. He let it lie. They arrived at the outskirts of Dodge City in the late afternoon of the third day, which was early May in 1873, a year when Dodge was already becoming what it would be known as a railhead town, a rough and functional place where the cattle trade met the railroad and created a concentrated energy that was sometimes exhilarating and sometimes simply dangerous, depending on the night and the company. Isaac had arranged with Dell for his wages from the drive, which would not be formally completed until the cattle were delivered to the stockyard pens the following morning, but Dell had paid him in advance, which was a trust built over years. Isaac had the wages in his pocket and a room arranged at the Dodge House, which was the town's principal hotel, and he found himself at the moment of arrival standing in the main street of Dodge with Alma Donnelly beside him, and the sudden, particular awareness that whatever had been developing over 3 days of trail conversation was about to be interrupted by the prosaic realities of two people arriving in a town with separate purposes. "Where will you stay?" he asked. She had a small amount of money. She had told him nothing specific about how much. "I'll find a boarding house," she said. "There must be respectable ones." "There are," he said. "Mrs. Pearl Hogan runs one on the south side of Front Street. It's decent and she's not the kind to ask unnecessary questions." Alma looked at him. "And how do you know what Mrs. Pearl Hogan's attitude toward questions is?" "I've stayed there twice between drives," he said. "She's practical. She cares whether you pay and whether you're clean and quiet. Everything else she considers your own business." A small pause. "Thank you," she said. He walked with her to Mrs. Hogan's boarding house, which was a 2-story white-painted building that looked slightly more permanent than its neighbors, with a porch and window boxes that had not yet been planted with their summer flowers. Mrs. Pearl Hogan was a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a face that had been weathered and was now interesting rather than pretty, and she charged Alma $2 a week for a room with a window and a shared bath down the hall, and she shook Alma's hand the way she apparently shook everyone's hand, with the focused grip of a businesswoman. Isaac walked Alma back to the door after the arrangements were made, and they stood on the porch of Mrs. Hogan's boarding house in the late afternoon light of Dodge City, and there was between them the specific awkwardness of two people who have been easy together for 3 days and are now confronting the question of what happens next. "I'll be in town at least another week," he said, "while Dell finalizes the sale and we settle accounts." She nodded. "If you're willing," he said carefully, "I'd like to take you to supper tomorrow evening if that suits you." She looked at him with that green gaze that saw more than most and gave back less than it saw, and she said, "I'm still married, Isaac." He absorbed this. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm asking if you'd like to have supper." Another pause, slightly longer than the ones before it. "Yes," she said, "tomorrow evening." He walked back to the Dodge house with the distinct and somewhat uncomfortable awareness that he was a man in a situation that had no obvious or easy outcome, and that the sensible course would be to note this, enjoy the supper, and move on when the drive required it. He sat on the edge of his bed in the clean, simple room he had taken, and he thought about this sensible course for approximately 5 minutes, and then he stopped thinking about it, because he already knew that sensible was not going to apply here. He was in love with her. He understood this with the same methodical clarity he applied to everything else. Not the dramatic, sudden kind of love that the novels he had read in college described, the lightning strike variety that seemed, in those descriptions, as much like illness as affection. This was something quieter and more certain, the kind of recognition that did not need to be decorated with intensity because it was already so genuinely itself. He was in love with a woman who was still legally married and who was running from something she had not fully told him yet, and who was fully and entirely herself in a way that made him feel that every person he had met before her had been slightly blurred by comparison. He was, he thought, in considerable difficulty. The following morning he was at the stockyards with Dell when it happened, when the past arrived, as it had always been going to. He was walking back toward Front Street after the cattle were penned and the preliminary count was done, and he turned a corner near the freight office, and he came face to face with a man he had never seen before who was nevertheless clearly looking for something or someone with the focused, unhurried attention of a professional. The man was thin, with dry, slightly humorous features, and the careful, assembled quality of someone who had learned to present himself as harmless. He was asking the clerk at the freight office something, and he had a paper in his hand, and as Isaac passed within earshot he caught the word Missouri and a name, Donnelly. Isaac stopped walking. He stood for 2 seconds in the middle of the street, reassessing everything with the speed of a man who had learned to think fast in open country. The man at the freight office had not seen him. Isaac turned in a direction away from Mrs. Hogan's boarding house and kept walking, and then he doubled back through an alley and came at the boarding house from the back and knocked on the kitchen door, which Mrs. Hogan's girl answered with a startled look. "I need to speak to Miss Donnelly," he said. "It's urgent." Mrs. Hogan appeared over her girl's shoulder, reading the situation with impressive speed. She nodded once and disappeared, and 2 minutes later Alma came down the back stairs into the kitchen wearing her traveling clothes, which meant she had never fully unpacked, which told Isaac something important about where she was in her own understanding of her safety. She looked at his face and she went still. "Someone is asking about you at the freight office," he said. "A thin man from Ohio. He has a paper with your name on it." All the color did not leave her face. She was not that kind of woman. But something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation, rapid and private. "Holloway," she said. "Gerald's partner." She looked at him sharply. "I told you about Holloway. You mentioned him." "Ohio, thin." She pressed her lips together. "Gerald sent him. It was not a question. Gerald would have sent him because Gerald would know I'd see Gerald coming and would not see Holloway until it was too late because Holloway looks harmless." "He does," Isaac agreed. "How much time do I have?" He thought about the distance between the freight office and this kitchen. 20 minutes maybe, If he's just asking around, maybe more. She was already moving. She turned and went back up the stairs, and Isaac stood in Mrs. Hogan's kitchen and felt the specific helplessness of a man who was watching someone he cared about being forced into a corner. And underneath the helplessness was something harder and colder. The kind of anger that is not hot and not irrational, but is simply the clear recognition of an injustice that will not be permitted to stand. She came back down in 4 minutes with her saddlebag over her shoulder and Patience's tack in her hands and the particular compressed, focused expression of a person who has already made the necessary calculations and arrived at the necessary decisions. Mrs. Hogan was standing by the stove. She had been listening. She was that kind of woman, the practical, paying attention kind. "There's a back way to the stables," Mrs. Hogan said. "I know," Alma said. "Thank you, I'll send your money when I'm established." "Don't worry about the money," Mrs. Hogan said. She paused, then with the dry directness that characterized her. "Are you running towards something or away from it?" Alma stopped for 1 second. She looked at Isaac, and then she looked back at Mrs. Hogan and said, "I'm trying to figure that out." Isaac followed her to the stables without asking whether she wanted him to. She glanced back once and didn't tell him to stop, which he took as permission. At Patience's stall, while she tacked the mare with practiced speed, she said, "You don't have to be involved in this." "I know," he said. "Holloway may have legal papers. If Gerald has filed something, an abandonment claim or a writ of some kind, it could create real trouble for anyone who assists me." "I know that too." She looked at him over Patience's back. "Then why are you here?" "Because you trusted me enough to tell me the truth about your situation," he said. "And because what you're describing is a man using the law as a tool to pursue someone he wants to control, and that's not the law working as it's supposed to, and I'm not in the habit of standing aside for things that aren't right." He paused. "And because I don't want you to disappear." The last sentence fell between them with a weight that surprised him even as he said it. He hadn't meant to say it exactly that way, but there it was. She held his gaze. Her hands had stopped moving for a moment, resting on Patience's saddle. "Isaac," she said, and then she stopped and just said his name again in a quieter register. "Isaac." "What do you need?" he said. She thought for 3 seconds. "I need to get out of Dodge without being seen by Holloway. And then I need to go somewhere I can establish myself without Gerald being able to find me through any official record. Because if he's filed legal papers, I need to be outside his reach until I can figure out how to fight this properly." "Colorado Territory," he said. "There's a town called Pueblo on the Arkansas River that's growing fast with the mining trade. It's far enough and there are enough new people that you'd disappear into it easily." He paused. "I have a friend there. Man named Frank Reyes. He owns a livery operation. He'd give you work that's legitimate and pay you properly and not ask about your history." Looked at him. "You have a friend in Pueblo. I've driven cattle through there twice. Frank is solid. And you're suggesting I go to Pueblo and work in a livery stable." "I'm suggesting you go somewhere safe where you can stop running and think about your next move," he said. "The livery work is just a practical entry point. It's not who you are." Another pause. Then something that was the precursor to a smile, the first real precursor he had seen. "All right," she said. "How do we get out of Dodge?" He knew the town well enough. They went north first, away from Front Street and the freight office, then west along the back of the residential area, and then turned south to pick up the trail toward the Arkansas River. They were out of Dodge City in 15 minutes without, as far as Isaac could tell, having been seen by anyone who knew Holloway's purpose. When they were far enough from town that the risk had diminished, they slowed their horses and rode side by side in the long afternoon light. "I have to go back," Isaac said. "Dell needs me to finish the drive settlement and I have obligations to the men." He paused. "I'll come to Pueblo when the work is done. 3 weeks, maybe 4. She looked at the road ahead. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice slightly lower than the one she usually used, "I'm going to tell you the whole story when you come to Pueblo." He looked at her. "About Gerald and Holloway and the fraud and all of it," she said. "You deserve to know the whole thing before you decide anything." "I've already decided," he said. "Isaac." There was something almost fond in the way she said it. "You're a very decided man. It's a useful quality," he said. She reached over, just for a moment, and put her hand on his forearm where it rested on his saddle horn. It was a brief, deliberate touch, not romantic in the obvious sense but entirely intimate in the real one, the gesture of someone who was choosing consciously to let someone else know that their presence mattered. He felt it like a struck chord. They reached a fork in the trail where their paths necessarily diverged. He needed to turn back east, she needed to continue west. She stopped patience and turned in the saddle to face him. "Frank Reyes," she said. "Pueblo, I'll find him." "He'll know my name," Isaac said. "Tell him I sent you," she nodded. She looked at him for a moment with that full, seeing gaze, and then she said, "Don't forget where you're going." "I won't," he said. She turned patience west and rode, and Isaac watched until she was far enough down the trail that he could no longer clearly distinguish her from the landscape. And then he turned his horse east and rode back toward Dodge City with the settled, clear feeling of a man who has found the direction he intends to move in for the rest of his life. He spent 3 more weeks in Dodge settling the drive accounts with Dell, and during those 3 weeks Holloway circled and inquired and eventually received, through the imperfect network of frontier gossip, a misleading report that a woman matching Alma's description had been seen heading south toward Indian Territory, which was both false and dangerous as a destination, and therefore credible as a rumor about someone running. Holloway spent 4 days pursuing that lead before apparently abandoning it, or deciding to take the information back to Gerald and regroup, because at the end of the 4th day, he was gone from Dodge. Isaac learned this through the freight office clerk, a talkative young man named Billy who knew everything that passed through the town and required only coffee and a willing listener to share it, and he felt a careful, measured relief. Not the relief that said the danger was over, because he understood it was not, but the relief that said the immediate crisis had more breathing room than it had had. He wrote a letter to Frank Reyes in Pueblo, which he sent by the mail service that ran along the Santa Fe Trail, explaining the situation in the plain and economical way he explained all situations. He said that a woman named Alma Donnelly would arrive, and that she was entirely trustworthy, and that she had skills with horses that were exceptional, and that he would be following in 3 weeks, and that if Frank could provide her honest work and a safe situation in the meantime, Isaac would owe him a debt of the kind that Frank could actually collect on, which was not a debt Isaac offered lightly. Frank Reyes was a man from a New Mexican family that had been in the region before it was American territory. A man in his early 40s who had built his livery business from nothing through exactly the combination of competence and stubbornness that such things required. He and Isaac had the friendship of 2 men who respected each other's quality without requiring explanation, and when he read Isaac's letter, he simply wrote back one line: "She'll have the work." Alma arrived in Pueblo 11 days after leaving Dodge, having ridden the distance with the same careful, competent steadiness she applied to everything. She found the Reyes livery on the edge of the growing town, introduced herself to Frank, mentioned Isaac's name, and was given a stall for patients and a room above the stable that was small and clean and genuinely private, and she went to work. She was extraordinary at the work. Frank had known she would be from Isaac's description, but experiencing it directly was something else. She could read a horse's condition with a glance and then confirm it with her hands, and she had an approach to difficult animals, the spooked, the abused, the simply contrary, that was based not on dominance or force, but on a kind of patient, persistent communication that produced results faster than anything Frank had seen. Within 2 weeks, he had moved her from stable work to the more valued role of horse assessment, which meant she was the one who evaluated horses that came in for sale or trade, and her assessments were so accurate that word began to spread among the buyers and sellers of Pueblo that the woman at Reyes livery was someone whose opinion on a horse was worth getting. She found this funny, in the dry, private way that she found most things that were simultaneously gratifying and slightly absurd. She wrote it in the small journal she had started keeping, not a diary precisely, but a record of observations. She was getting good at frontier horse dealing, she wrote, which was not what she had planned, but then again she had not been planning when she left Abilene. She had been surviving, and these things were not the same. She thought about Isaac with a frequency that she noted and did not entirely suppress, which was itself unusual. She was not a woman who had been in the habit of thinking about men with longing. Her experience of men had been, after Gerald, not precisely negative but cautious. The wariness of someone who had learned that charm and construction could be indistinguishable from genuine character, and that the difference only became visible over time and under pressure. She trusted time and pressure because she had learned they were reliable, but they were slow, and waiting for them was a particular kind of loneliness. What was different about Isaac Merritt, she wrote in her journal on a warm evening in the room above the stable, was that he had not tried to charm her. He had been direct and he had been honest and he had made her feel, from the moment he asked her name on that riverbank, not like someone to be persuaded or managed, but like someone to be known. The distinction was vast. The distinction was the entire difference. He arrived on a Tuesday in late June, riding a good bay horse she had not seen before and looking dusty and trail-worn in the way a man looked after hard travel, and he walked into the Ray's livery and found her in the middle of evaluating a horse for a miner who wanted to sell it. He stopped in the doorway and watched her work for a moment, and she felt his presence the way she felt changes in the weather, not through sight or sound, but through some other sense entirely. And she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway with the dust still on him, and the hat pushed back in the way that she had already decided was characteristic of him. And something in her chest moved in a way that she was no longer willing to pretend, was simply relief at the arrival of a friend. She finished the evaluation. She told the miner the horse was sound but had a slight issue in the left hind pastern that would affect its value for heavy hauling, though not for light work. The miner looked disappointed and then thoughtful and then departed with the information stored, and Alma turned to Isaac and walked toward him. "You made it," she said. "I said I would," he said. She put out her hand and he shook it, and then neither of them let go immediately, and they stood in the doorway of Frank Ray's livery holding hands in what was formally a handshake, and was actually something considerably more than that. And Frank Ray's, who had come in from the back, took one look at the situation and went back out the way he came. That evening, in the small restaurant on the main street of Pueblo that served the best food the town offered, which was not extraordinary but was honest and plentiful, Alma told Isaac everything. She told him about Gerald's fraud from the beginning, how she had first noticed the locked drawer, how she had assembled the picture piece by piece, how she had heard Holloway use the word handled in the hallway of her own house. She told him about the 3 days of preparation and the dawn departure. She told him about the deed to her father's house in Missouri and why she couldn't go back to claim it yet. She told him about the legal exposure she might be facing if Gerald had filed papers, abandonment of marriage, possibly, or some more creative legal instrument designed to force her return or compromise her standing. Isaac listened with the total attention she had come to expect from him, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "There's a lawyer in Pueblo, a man named Harrington who came out from Chicago and who practices real law, not frontier improvisation. I talked to him yesterday." She stared at him. "You talked to a lawyer before you talked to me." "I talked to him before I had the full details, yes, because I wanted to know what the framework looked like before we discussed specifics." He paused. "I hope that doesn't feel presumptuous." She sat with this for a moment. On one level it was presumptuous. It was action taken on her behalf without her knowledge. On another level, it was entirely characteristic of Isaac Merritt, who thought ahead and prepared and did not act impulsively but who, when he decided on a direction, moved efficiently. "What did the lawyer say?" she said. "He said that if your husband has filed an abandonment claim, you have legal standing to counter it on grounds of constructive desertion, which in simple terms means that When a spouse makes the home genuinely unsafe, the other party's departure is legally justified. He also said that if you have evidence of fraud, which it sounds like you have in the form of documents and direct knowledge, the legal picture changes significantly in your favor, because a husband who is himself a criminal has diminished standing to pursue legal remedies against a wife who left him. She absorbed this. That's a better legal situation than I thought I was in. Yes, he said. Harrington said you should make an appointment. She looked at him across the table with the full candor of a woman who had decided without drama that she was done being careful with this particular person. Isaac, she said, do you understand what you're involving yourself in? Yes, he said. Gerald is not a harmless man. Holloway is persistent and he's clever in a specific way. He knows how to use systems. Legal systems, social systems. He knows how to make a woman look unreliable. I know, he said, and you're still here. I'm still here, he said. And I'm going to say something directly, because that seems to be the way we talk, and I'd rather say it directly than let it sit unsaid. I'm in love with you. I have been since the Cimarron River, or close enough to since then that the distinction doesn't matter. I'm not saying that to pressure you into anything, and I understand perfectly well that your situation is complicated, and that you have every reason to be cautious about everything and everyone. I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you deserve to know what I'm actually operating from. Alma Donnelly sat across the table from Isaac Merritt in a restaurant in Pueblo, Colorado Territory in June of 1873, and she looked at him for a long time. I'm still legally married, she said finally. Yes, which means this conversation is premature at a minimum. At a minimum, he agreed. But the conversation itself is not premature. The conversation is just accurate. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said something that cost her something. He could see that it cost her something in the way she took a breath before saying it. I don't want you to go back to driving cattle, she said. I know that's your work and I'm not in any position to ask anything of you, and I'm not asking. I'm simply stating that I don't want you to go. He looked at her. Then I won't. Isaac, I have savings, he said. 2 years' worth of wages put back. I've been considering what comes next for a while before I met you. I was thinking about land. Frank Reyes tells me there's good grazing land available outside Pueblo at prices that won't stay low much longer, because the mining population is growing and someone is going to have to feed it. She blinked. You're talking about cattle ranching. Small scale at first, he said. With someone who knows horses and can work the animals side by side. He paused. I'm not asking you to marry me, Alma. I understand you can't do that right now, and I wouldn't ask you to do something you're not in a position to do. I'm asking you whether you want to build something here. She held his gaze, and then she said with the precise, honest simplicity that was her greatest quality, yes, I want to build something here. Attorney Harrington was a compact, precise man from Chicago who wore his city manners with an unself-conscious confidence that Pueblo's rougher inhabitants seemed to find either amusing or reassuring, depending on their situation. He saw Alma twice in the following week, listened with professional intensity, reviewed the documents she had brought, the deed to her father's Missouri house, several letters from the Abilene period that contained references to land transactions she had preserved, because her instinct had told her to, and then he delivered his assessment. The marriage could be dissolved through the territorial court on grounds of constructive desertion and documented evidence of criminal behavior by the husband, he said. The process would take time, probably 4 to 6 months if it moved quickly. Gerald Foss, if he had indeed filed papers, had filed them in the Kansas court, and the Colorado Territorial Court was under no obligation to enforce Kansas proceedings that were themselves legally dubious given the circumstances. He recommended they file immediately and establish jurisdiction in Colorado. He also recommended a letter to the Kansas authorities regarding the land fraud, which was a bold step but one that had a potentially important benefit. If Gerald was being investigated or prosecuted in Kansas, His ability to pursue Alma legally was severely compromised. Alma said, "Do it," without hesitation. Isaac watched her say it with a feeling that he recognized as the specific form of admiration that was not simple, but was compounded the admiration for courage that you feel only when you understand exactly what the courage is costing. Over the following months, they built what they had agreed to build. Isaac bought land 40 acres of good grass south of Pueblo, with a creek that ran reliably and a natural windbreak of cottonwoods along the eastern edge. He bought 10 head of cattle to start with and a breeding pair of the better quality horses that came through Frank Ray's livery at prices Frank facilitated without making a profit on, because Frank was that kind of man. Alma worked the livery through the summer and into fall, and on her days away from the livery, she was at the land with Isaac, doing the necessary work of establishing a small operation from raw ground fencing, water management, building the small sturdy barn that Isaac designed, and they raised with the help of 3 neighboring men and a Mexican family named Ortega who had the adjacent 40 acres and who received the same help in return, which was the economy of the frontier. They worked side by side, and they talked while they worked the way people who genuinely like each other talk, continuously, about everything and nothing, about the land and the cattle and the specific problem of the fence line on the north end, and about natural history, and about what Alma had been reading, and about Frank Ray's opinion of the territorial governor, and about whether the mining population would stabilize or continue to grow, and about what Isaac's sister Clara was doing back in Ohio. They talked, and they learned each other in the slow, solid way that working alongside someone teaches you things that conversation alone cannot. They were careful. They were careful because Alma's situation required it, and because they were both people who understood that the right thing done at the wrong time was still wrong, and also because they were people of genuine integrity who cared about doing things in the right order. But there were evenings on the porch of the small house Isaac had built modest, sound, with 2 rooms and a proper chimney that drew. When the sun was going down over the Colorado plain, and the air smelled of grass and the cattle were settled, and everything was quiet in the specific way that the frontier was quiet when it was being kind, and they would sit with coffee and talk until the dark came. And in those evenings, the careful distance that they maintained during the working hours collapsed into something warmer and more honest, and they would sit closer than the daylight hours permitted, and sometimes he would reach over and take her hand, and she would not pull it back. In November, the Colorado Territorial Court granted the dissolution of Alma's marriage to Gerald Foss. Attorney Harrington delivered the news on a cold Tuesday morning with the satisfied expression of a man whose argument has been proven correct, and Alma sat with the document in her hands and felt something that she had not expected, not straightforward relief, but a complex layering of feelings, because the document was a legal acknowledgement of the end of 3 years of her life. And even when that life had been a trap, it had still been her life, and endings had weight even when they were necessary. Isaac was with her when she read it. He sat across the small table in Harrington's office, and he watched her read, and he did not fill the silence with reassurance or celebration, because he understood that this was a moment that required simply being present rather than managing. When she looked up from the document, her eyes were dry. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. She folded the document and put it in her coat, and then she looked at him with a directness that was somehow different from all the previous direct looks, more open, more freely offered. "Ask me," she said. He understood immediately what she meant. He had told her months ago, and he had not repeated it or pressed it, because that was not who he was, and she had known it was still true without requiring repetition. And now she was telling him that the circumstances had changed. He looked at her across the table in Attorney Harrington's small Pueblo office, with the November light coming through the window and the sound of the street outside, and he said, "Alma Donnelly, will you marry me?" And she said, with the full, clean, unencumbered truth of a woman who had fought very hard to arrive at a place where she could say this properly. Yes, I will. They were married in January of 1874 in Pueblo by a justice of the peace whose name was Thomas Cal, with Frank Reyes and his wife Alina standing as witnesses and Mrs. Pearl Hogan, who had made the trip from Dodge City because Alma had written to invite her and she had come, because she was that kind of woman, standing in the back with the expression of someone who had bet correctly on a long shot. It was a small ceremony, practical and honest, and it was followed by a dinner at the Reyes house that was abundant and warm and noisy in the way of a celebration that has earned itself through difficulty. And after the dinner, Isaac and Alma rode home together to the small house on the 40-acre spread south of town in the January cold, and they went inside to the warmth of the fire Isaac had left burning, and they were home. Alma wrote in her journal that night, very briefly. She wrote, "I have been afraid of many things. This is not one of them." They worked the land through the winter and into the spring, expanding as the finances permitted, adding cattle when a good deal came through, improving the barn, and then building a second outbuilding for equipment. In the spring, Isaac wrote to his sister Clara in Ohio and told her about Alma and about the land and about the life they were building. And Clara wrote back a letter of such unstinting and generous happiness that Alma, who had never met her, felt immediately that they would be friends when the distance could be bridged. And the Kansas situation resolved itself in the spring of 1874 in a way that nobody had fully predicted, but that Harrington had considered a possibility. Gerald Foss and his partner Holloway were arrested in the spring of that year on charges related to the land fraud, brought by a combination of Kansas state investigators and the federal postal authorities, who had a particular interest because some of the fraudulent communications had moved through the federal mail. The arrests were noted in the newspapers, and Harrington clipped the relevant notice and sent it to Alma with a brief accompanying note that said simply, "The matter appears fully resolved." Alma sat on the porch of her house and read the clipping, and then she put it down on the board beside her, and she looked out at the land, their land, and she felt the last weight lift, not with drama, with the quiet, ordinary sensation of a burden set down after so long carrying it that the absence of it was itself remarkable. Isaac came out of the barn and saw her sitting there with that expression and walked up to the porch. "News," he said. "Gerald was arrested," she said. "And Holloway." He sat down next to her. He didn't say anything for a moment. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. She leaned against him, which was something she did in private without self-consciousness now. Let herself be physically close to him in the simple, affectionate way of someone who has decided that safety and comfort are things she is allowed to have. He put his arm around her. They sat there on the porch in the spring light of the Colorado prairie, and the cattle were visible in the middle distance, and Patience was in the paddock near the barn, and the cottonwoods along the eastern fence line were putting out their first pale green leaves, and everything was ordinary. Peacefully, genuinely, fully ordinary. It was, Alma thought, the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. Their son was born in December of 1874, a healthy, loud, red-faced boy whom they named Patrick after Alma's father, and who from his very first weeks demonstrated what Isaac called strong opinions, and Alma called perfectly normal human reactions to an unreasonable world. Patrick Merritt arrived in the world with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubbornness, and he was adored. Frank Reyes was his godfather, a role Frank accepted with the particular seriousness he brought to everything he considered worth doing, and Clara Merritt, Isaac's sister, made the journey from Ohio the following spring to meet her nephew and stayed for 3 months and became exactly the friend that Alma had expected her to be: sharp, funny, honest, and deeply warm. Clara was 23 and had a precise, wry humor that made Alma laugh in a way she had not laughed since she was a girl, and she helped with Patrick with the confident ease of someone who had grown up in a large family, and she and Alma would sit on the porch in the evenings after the baby was settled and talk about everything. About the law, about women's rights, about the specific difficulties of being a woman with a strong mind in a world that found strong-minded women alternately fascinating and threatening. "You should teach," Clara said one evening. "Your mind is too good to be just a rancher's wife." "I'm not just a rancher's wife," Alma said. "No," Clara said, "you're a rancher." "That's different, but I know what you mean," Alma said. "I've been thinking about it." She had, in fact, been thinking about it. Pueblo was growing and its schooling provision was inadequate, and there was a real need, and she had more education than most of the people in a 50-mile radius, and she was good at the work of explaining things clearly. She brought it up with Isaac that night, and his response was immediate. "Do it," he said. "We can manage the land, and you'd be excellent at it." She became, in the fall of 1875, one of the teachers at Pueblo's growing school, teaching the older children ages 10 through 15 reading, mathematics, and natural history, which she included because she believed it was important and because she was good at it, and because the children were fascinated by the organized world of living things in a way that confirmed her belief. Isaac ran the ranch. They hired a hand named Tomas, who was 18 and from the Ortega family next door, and who was reliable and good with the cattle in the way that some people simply were without needing to be taught. The operation grew, not dramatically but steadily, the way solid things grow. Another 20 acres purchased in 1876, another dozen cattle, a proper well dug to complement the creek, an expansion of the house that added 2 more rooms and a larger kitchen, because by then they knew there would be more children. Their daughter was born in 1876 in March, with Alma's green eyes and a startling cap of red hair that must have come from some Donnelly ancestor nobody had accounted for, and they named her Margaret, for Alma's mother, who had died the previous year back in Missouri, died with the knowledge, conveyed through a long letter that Alma had written explaining everything, that her daughter was safe and well and living a life that would have been unimaginable from the front parlor of the house in Missouri, but that was genuinely and deeply hers. Margaret Donnelly, the elder, had written back in the last letter before her death, in her exact, opinion-laden script, that she was glad Alma had gone west because it had clearly produced a better result than staying would have, which was about as close to approval as her mother had ever offered on any subject, and which Alma received with the complicated, fond exasperation that was the specific emotion her mother had always produced. Little Margaret Merritt grew fast and loud, and had her grandmother's quality of fierce opinion delivered with total confidence, and she and Patrick fought and allied and competed with the specific intensity of siblings close in age, and Alma watched them and felt a gratitude that was too large to articulate for the ordinary, noisy, difficult, beautiful fact of them. In 1877 they had another son, whom they named James after Isaac's father, and who was a quieter, more observant child than either Patrick or Margaret, a watcher like his mother with his father's patience. The ranch grew. The school grew. Alma taught for 6 years, and then was offered the position of school administrator, overseeing the expanded Pueblo school system that now had 4 teachers, and served the children of the mining and ranching community that had continued to grow around them. She took the position with the same direct, clear-eyed approach she took to everything, and she was very good at it, and she fought regularly and persistently with the county board over funding and resources, and the particular battles that people who care about education fight in every generation and every place. Isaac, watching her conduct a contentious meeting with 3 county commissioners who had consistently underfunded the school, said afterward that she was the most formidable person in any room she entered. She said, "I grew up in a house where my mother held opinions with the authority of natural law. I learned from a master." He laughed. It was one of the things she loved about him most, the way he laughed, fully and without self-consciousness, when something genuinely struck him. She had made him laugh. In the 12 years she had known him, a great many times, and each time it gave her the same satisfaction, the clean, particular satisfaction of a thing done well. In 1879, Isaac's sister Clara came west permanently. She had been offered a teaching position in a school in Denver, which she accepted, and she settled in Colorado with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for permission to go somewhere larger than what she had been given. She remained Alma's closest friend outside of Isaac himself for the rest of their lives, and her own story, the teaching career, the women's suffrage work she became involved in through the Colorado movement, the man she eventually married in 1882, a newspaper editor from Denver named George, who was also a reader and also opinionated and also deeply good, was a story that ran parallel to Alma and Isaac's. Their lives interwoven through the years like the threads of a fabric that is stronger for being woven together. The Missouri house, Alma's father's house, was sold in 1880 through a legal arrangement that Harrington facilitated from Pueblo. She had not been able to go back, and she had decided, finally, that going back was not what the house required of her. What it required was to be converted into something that honored what her father had been, which was a practical man who had valued useful things. She sold it and put the money into the Pueblo School Fund as a donation designated for books and materials, and she told Harrington to make sure the donation was recorded in her father's name, Patrick Donnelly, blacksmith, Missouri. Frank Reyes retired from the livery in 1881 and handed the operation to his son Miguel, and Isaac and Alma hosted the retirement gathering at their house, which by then was large enough and well-established enough that hosting a gathering of 60 people was a thing that could be done without crisis. Elena Reyes cried, and Frank pretended not to notice, and Del Hooper was there. He had come through Pueblo on a drive the month before, and Isaac had tracked him down and invited him, and he had come because Del, like all the solid people in Alma and Isaac's life, was the kind of person who showed up when invited. He stood on the porch with Isaac after dark, and they drank whiskey and talked about the Cimarron crossing, and Del said, "I knew when you walked across to her that you were not going to be walking back alone." Isaac considered this. "Was it that obvious?" "Only to me," Del said, "and I've known you a long time." Alma came out of the house at that moment, looking for Isaac to help adjudicate a dispute between Patrick and Margaret that had escalated to a level she considered amusing rather than serious, and she found him on the porch with Del and the whiskey, and she stopped and looked at them both with the expression that Isaac loved best, the slight, private smile, the eyes that saw everything. "Del," she said, "I hope you're not encouraging him." "Mrs. Merritt," Del said, with a gravity that contained its own humor, "I would never." She looked at Isaac. "Patrick put a frog in Margaret's hat. She's threatening retaliation. I need a mediator with more authority than me." Isaac put down the whiskey glass. "I'll go," he said, then to Del, "She says she has less authority than me. She's being ironic." Del nodded. "I figured." Isaac went inside, and Alma watched him go, and then she stayed on the porch for a moment, leaning against the post, looking out at the night. Del stood companionably quiet beside her, which was the thing about Del. He understood that silence was a form of company. "He told me about the Cimarron," Alma said, "early on. He said he watched me cross and needed to know my name." "That's accurate," Del said. She smiled. "I almost didn't tell him," she said. "I almost said none of your business and walked away." Del looked at her. "What stopped you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "He wasn't trying to impress me," she said, "and he wasn't trying to help me. He had watched me cross and I hadn't needed help. He just wanted to know who I was." A pause. "That was new." Del nodded slowly. "He's a good man," he said, which was the most extensive personal tribute she had ever heard Del offer anyone. "Yes," she said simply, "he is." By 1884, the ranch was producing well enough that Isaac was able to hire 2 full-time hands and step back from the most physically demanding aspects of the daily work, which was a change his body had begun to request with increasing clarity after 11 years of hard labor. He was 40 now, strong still, but not without the accumulated costs of years in all-weather doing physical work. And he had developed an interest in the range management side of the operation, the science of it, as he called it, which made Alma smile every time, because it echoed something he had said on the trail to Dodge in 1873 about the study of animals and organization. He had been reading, steadily, in the agricultural science that was beginning to be written and circulated in the period, about grass management and water rights and soil health, and the long-term sustainability of grazing operations, which was not a common preoccupation among ranchers of that time, and which put him slightly at odds with some of his neighbors, but which Alma thought was exactly right, because Isaac had always thought in longer time frames than most. Their children were growing fast. Patrick was 10, serious and already interested in the horses with his mother's quality of attention. Margaret was 8, loud and funny and capable of the most disarming sweetness when it suited her, which was the specific emotional armament of a middle child with 2 brothers. James was 7, still the observer, already showing a quality with words that made Alma think he might end up doing something with language writing, perhaps, or law. They had a 4th child in 1882, another boy named Thomas, who was 2 years old in 1884, and who was already demonstrating, to Alma's private amusement, the exact temperament of her mother Margaret Donnelly Sr., intense opinions, total certainty, absolute conviction that the universe ought to organize itself around his preferences. He was going to be formidable, Alma told Isaac. Isaac said, looking at his youngest son with a mixture of pride and mild apprehension, that the world would survive it. In the fall of 1884, Clara came to visit with her husband George, and one evening after dinner when the children were in bed, the 4 of them sat around the table with the lamp turned low and talked in the way that old friends talk, with the ease of people who no longer need to perform or explain themselves, who can simply be. George, the newspaper editor, asked Alma and Isaac how they had met, not because he didn't know the story, but because he liked hearing it, which was the thing about good stories, that they bore retelling. Isaac looked at Alma across the table. Alma said there was a river crossing. The Cimarron, Isaac said. It was running high, Alma said. Most people wouldn't cross. She crossed, Isaac said, and he was on the far bank, Alma said. Watching, Isaac said. Clara laughed softly. And then? She said, because she also knew the story but wanted it told completely. He took his hat off, Alma said, and he asked me my name. She looked at Isaac as she said it, in the low lamplight of their own kitchen, in the house they had built, with their children asleep upstairs, with the land outside quiet under the Colorado sky, with 11 years of life between that river crossing and this table. He looked back at her the way he had always looked at her, with the total, clear, unguarded attention of a man who had found exactly what he had been looking for, and who had never stopped marveling at the fact. And she told me, he said. I told him, she agreed. George, the newspaper editor, reached over and took Clara's hand, and the 4 of them sat in the comfortable silence of people who are, in all the ways that count, exactly where they are supposed to be. In the years that followed, the Merritt Ranch expanded to 120 acres and became known, in the Pueblo area, for the quality of its horses. Alma had gradually shifted the operation's focus toward breeding and training, because that was where her genuine expertise lay, and because the market for good horses in the growing Colorado territory was consistent and strong. Patrick, who was 17 by 1891, was already her equal with the horses and would surpass her within a few years, which Alma did not find threatening but found deeply satisfying. The satisfying of someone who has given something they love to someone who will carry it forward. Margaret, at 15, had her grandmother's opinions and her mother's intelligence and her father's patience in equal measure, which made her, Isaac said, the most dangerous combination imaginable. She was going to go east for school. Alma had decided, as soon as the money and the circumstances permitted, because Margaret's mind required more than Pueblo could currently offer, And Alma was not the kind of mother who let the limits of her own circumstances become the limits of her children's. James, at 14, was writing. He had a notebook that he filled with observations about the land, about the people in town, about the conversations he overheard, and Alma had read it once, with his permission, and had felt a recognition that was almost physical, because the quality of attention in those pages was the same quality she had cultivated in herself since girlhood. He was going to do something with it. She didn't know what. She knew he was going to do something. Thomas, the youngest, the fierce, opinionated one, was 12 in 1894 and had already decided with complete certainty that he was going to be a lawyer. He had told them this at age 9 and had not changed his position. Isaac and Alma had exchanged a look of the kind that parents exchange when their child says something simultaneously amusing and completely credible, and they had both concluded, privately and then jointly, that he probably would. On a spring evening in 1895, 22 years after the Cimarron crossing, Alma sat on the porch of her house with a cup of coffee and watched Isaac come up from the lower pasture, where he had been checking the fence line with Tomas, who had now been their ranch hand for 19 years, and who had become, in that time, something between an employee and a family member. The frontier's own kind of kinship, built from shared work and shared difficulty and the long accumulation of reliability. Isaac came up the porch steps and settled into the chair beside her and accepted the second cup of coffee that she poured from the pot she had brought out with exactly this in mind, because after 22 years she knew his movements the way she knew the land, with an intimacy that was below conscious thought in the body's own deep memory. "Good fence," she said. "Good fence," he said. "Tomas fixed the north corner," she nodded. They sat with the spring evening coming in around them, the air warm enough now to be pleasant, the cottonwoods along the eastern fence line full and rustling, the distant sound of the cattle settling for the night, the closer sound of Patrick in the barn finishing up with the horses. "Patrick's thinking about going to Colorado Springs," she said. "He told me this morning. There's a breeder there who's working with the better bloodlines from Kentucky, and he wants to learn from him." Isaac was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "A year, maybe 2, he'd come back." "He should go," Isaac said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud. Let it be real before I just agree to it." He understood that. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. The sun was going down over the Colorado plain in the way it went down out there, slowly, with enormous colors, the sky moving through orange and red and then the deep violet that precede the dark. They sat and watched it as they had watched it hundreds of times from this porch, and it was still not ordinary. It had never become ordinary. The sky out here had a way of insisting on itself that did not diminish with familiarity. "Do you remember," Alma said, "what Dell said at Frank's retirement party? Said he knew when you walked across to me at the river that you weren't going to walk back alone." Isaac smiled. "I remember." "Were you that obvious?" she said with a note of amusement. "Only to Dell," he said, "who has known me too long." A pause. "I was not trying to be obvious. I was trying to be direct without being presumptuous." "You were," she said. "You were exactly that." He looked at her. "And what were you when you told me your name?" She thought about it honestly. "I was deciding," she said. "I had been careful for a long time by then, very careful. And you were asking for something small and specific, and you were not performing anything. You were just asking." She paused. "I decided I could afford to give you that much. And the rest." She turned and looked at him. This man she had known for 22 years, this man who had taken his hat off on a riverbank and asked her name and had never, in all the years since, asked her for more than she was willing to give, and had always been there with everything she needed. "The rest," she said, "was the best decision I ever made." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was old between them now, but had lost none of its meaning. The meaning of a man who had never taken for granted that he was loved, and who therefore always received it as the gift it was. The last of the sun dropped below the horizon, and the violet deepened toward dark, and the first stars appeared in the east over the Colorado plain, And from inside the house came the voices of their younger children, Thomas and James, arguing about something with the animated, harmless energy of boys who are fed and safe and full of life. And from the barn came Patrick's voice, talking to the horses in the low, continuous murmur that was his mother's gift passed to him, and the sound of the horses responding, and the sound of the night coming in quietly around all of it. Alma Donnelly had been the most fearless woman at the river crossing. Not because she had no fear, but because she had calculated the river and decided she could cross it, and she had committed to the crossing and she had not stopped. She had done the same thing, 22 years earlier, when a man in a dusty hat had stood on the far bank and asked for her name. And the crossing had led here, to this porch, this land, this man beside her, these children inside, this life that was entirely and irreducibly hers. She leaned her head against Isaac's shoulder in the dark, and the stars came fully out above the Colorado plain, and everything was, at last and in full, as it was supposed to be.